And greetings, saints of the Most High. Welcome to another installment of the Messianic Torah Observer. Rod Thomas coming to you on a very wintry preparation day here in the DFW. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to fellowship with me here today. And as always, beloved, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of TMTO finds you, your families, and your fellowships well and blessed. Well, as I am publishing this installment of TMTO, it is the 9th day of the 10th month of Yah's sacred calendar year, which translates to January 10, 2025. And guess what, beloved? We are going to begin a brand new discussion series. And you know that I love those of you who've been with me any length of time. Know that I really enjoy doing series. When I talk about series here on the podcast realm, we're talking about a series of posts that are more than one. It could be as we just got done with the, what was the one I just did? The Noahide laws. That was a 2-part series. I've done multiple series that were 2, 3, 4, 5 parts long. Now, this series is going to be on the person our Bibles refer to in Genesis 14 and Hebrews 7 as the Melchizedek and the royal priestly order that embodies this mysterious persona of the Melchizedek. Now, I'm not entirely sure how many individual parts will make up this series right now. I'm thinking 3, but there could be more, depending on how deep we're led to go into this subject as it relates to the eternal priesthood and the priestly order as described in the book of Hebrews. This will be one of the more important series that we've embarked upon. And I say this because so much of our salvation and our covenant relationship with the Almighty is inextricably linked to the Melchizedekian priestly order that is currently manned and operated by our master, our older brother, and soon-coming King, Yahushua HaMashiach. Now, for those of you who may be looking for a discussion on the 12th parasha, or the 12th reading of the 3-year Torah reading cycle we typically do on the Sabbaths, I humbly encourage you to listen to our post entitled, "We Must Operate at Abraham's Trusting Faith Level." So how do we get there? Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections 12. It was posted back in, I believe, 2021, maybe. I think it was. And so for your convenience, beloved, I'll go ahead and put the link to that discussion in this discussion's transcript. But this will be part 1 of the series, which I have entitled The Royal Priesthood, exploring the historical, spiritual, and eschatological roles of Melchizedek. So what do you say we start this series off and start looking at this from the perspective of the historical context of the Genesis 14 storyline? And so here it is in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, that we're introduced to this person that is referred to by Moshe as Melchizedek. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the bulk of this series' content will center on the encounter our patriarch Abram had with a mysterious gentleman who Moses referred to as Melchizedek, king of Salem. And this is again recorded in Genesis Bereshit chapter 14, verse 18. The way Moshe introduces Melchizedek to the Genesis 14 narrative is as if this gentleman belongs there. In fact, this Melchizedek shows up to a meeting between Avram and the king of Sedom or Sodom. And Moshe places this meeting in the valley of Sheva, which happened to be in Melchizedek's backyard, given that he was the established king of Salem. The occasion for this meetup was to discuss what was to happen with the spoils from the battle that Avram received from his victory over King Chedorlaomer's three-state federation of kings that went to war against the city-states of the plain. Genesis chapter 14, verses 1 through 11. And the reason our man Avram got himself involved in the war in the first place was that his nephew, Lot, who had established his dwelling in lands that were adjacent to some of these city-states of the plain, had been taken as a prisoner of that war. Genesis chapter 14, verse 12. And so, upon learning what had befallen his nephew Lot, Avram summoned 318 members of his household, his family, his estate, his servants, and they pursued and engaged the marauding Confederates and freed the captives of war, including his nephew Lot, along with their possessions. Genesis chapter 14, verse 16. And it is upon Avram's victorious return from this battle that we are introduced to the mysterious Melchizedek. The text records that this Melchizedek shows up to a meeting between the unnamed king of Sedom or Sodom with bread and wine. And amid this impromptu meeting, Melchizedek proceeds to bless both Avram and God Most High, El Elyon, whom he declared delivered Avram's enemies into his hand. Genesis chapter 14, verses 19 and 20, the Lexham English Bible rendering. And there is a parenthetical insertion in this section of the passage that declares this Melchizedek, in addition to being the king of Salem, as a priest of El Elyon, Jehovah Most High. And so, in response to Melchizedek's blessings, Avram renders unto him a tenth, that being a tithe of everything. That is, we're presuming that everything is the spoils of that war. Genesis chapter 14, verse 20. There is certainly a lot to unpack in these 4 verses. And over the course of the next installments of this series, we'll conduct a thorough unpacking of this interesting passage. Now, in and of itself, this passage of Torah would hold little meaning to us apart from it being a record of a historic Hebrew event. But we find as we continue along historic and spiritual scriptural lines that our mysterious Melchizedek, more so his royal priestly order, the royal Melchizedekian priestly order, that is, it pops up. He pops up. His name, his title, pops up several times in direct relation to our glorious master, our older brother, and our soon-coming king, Yehoshua Messiah. And this is why we are embarking on this journey, beloved. Scripture directly attaches the royal Melchizedekian priestly order to Yeshua, our master and savior. And because we belong to Yehoshua, and our ultimate destiny is to reign with him in his kingdom, that is, but is not yet, his royal priestly pedigree is also our pedigree. And we'll certainly get deeper into all of this, Abba willing, in succeeding installments of this series. But I want to spend the remainder of this installment briefly discussing elements of the Genesis 14, verse 18 account that I hope will help us to better understand and appreciate the culture, the history, the religious situation, and context of this story. Let's begin with the ancient Near Eastern context surrounding this event between Melchizedek and Avram. According to Reductio ad Absalom, the world's population at the time of this historic event between the Melchizedek and Avram took place, which biblical scholars place around 2000 to 1800 BCE, is challenging due to the lack of precise historical records. However, scholars generally estimate that the global population was likely between 7 to 10 million people during this period. Now, this estimate is based on various factors, including the population growth rates and the extended lifespans of the ancient peoples of that part of the world that are mentioned in ancient texts, as well as in various archaeological and anthropological studies. Consequently, the unnamed author of this article does not give much credence to the Bible's accuracy, and so he chooses to use mathematical reasoning in conjunction to presumed birth rates and the prevalence of polygamous relationships taking place during those days, the fantastic longevity of the souls living during that time, the absence of birth control, and the ancient Middle Eastern culture that valued fertility and large families to help drum up his rather shocking population numbers. The author, in fact, suggests a world population as high as, get this, 73,242,186 people living on the earth at the time Abraham began having children. I don't know what to say about that. I just can't wrap my head around it. Regardless, Bible scholars tend to err on the side of proposing higher world population numbers than fewer world population numbers, which leads to us seeking to gain an understanding of how the ancient ones were apportioned throughout the ancient Near East in Avram's day. And when we talk about where these people were living and dwelling, or how they were living and dwelling, we have to look at the concept of the city-states. During Avram's day, the ancient Near East saw the rise of city-states. Each city-state was ruled by its own king. For example, Amraphel, king of Shinar; Arioch, king of Elasar; Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam; Tidal, king of Goyim; Bera, king of Sodom or Sedom; Bersha, king of Gomorrah; Shinab, king of Zedobim; Zaor or Zoar, king of Bela; and our Melchizedek, king of Salem, and so forth. Now, these city-states, along with their leaders, their kings, often had their own patron gods or idols, along with their associated ritualistic religious practices. Our Melchizedek, however, would have been an exception to the socio-religious norms of these other city-states, as he served no idol or pagan deities, but only served Jehovah Most High, El Elyon. Within the context of this meeting between Avram and Melchizedek, the backdrop of this meeting, the cause of this meeting, the event that led to this meeting was the Battle of the Kings. One of the most notable events that is depicted in Genesis 14, and it's where we just spoke about this coalition or this federation of kings that was led by Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, attacks and he ravages the various city-states of the plain, including Sodom and Gomorrah. This battle is illustrative of a recurring cycle of battles between city-states and kingdoms that was common in the ancient Near East of Avram's day. The other thing we need to consider is the development of writing and record keeping back in those days. This era saw the development of cuneiform writing that is believed to have originated in Mesopotamia in the Shinar region. The cuneiform writing allowed for the recording of city-state laws, city-state treaties, and historical events in those city-states. Now, this was crucial for the administration of city-states and their transmission of cultural and religious ideas. We have to also consider the trade and commerce involving these city-states. Trade routes were well established throughout the ancient Near East in those days. These trade routes, they connected various city-states and regions, which facilitated the trading of goods such as textiles, metals, and foodstuffs between city-states, fostering economic and cultural exchanges. Then we have the issue of religious practices and priesthoods. The period of Avram's time, was marked by the establishment of organized priesthoods and religious practices. And in fact, many Bible enthusiasts believe that the legendary Tower of Babel was not only an edifice the people of Shinar built in defiance of Jehovah, but it also served as a pagan temple that no doubt was erected to appeal to a certain set of gods. And so in Avram's day, temples were central to everyday life, everyday city-state life, and royal priests like Melchizedek played significant roles in the religious ceremonies and governance of their respective city-states. Now, within these ancient socio-religious constructs, there were various key players who were instrumental in making each city-state function. First and foremost, kings. Kings were considered to be city-states' divine representative. Kings were often seen as representative or surrogates of the city-states' gods on earth. And these ruled with the belief that their authority was granted by divine right. Then we have the aspect of the king where he is the military leader for the city-state. Kings would lead their armies, usually made up of city-state citizens, into battle, defending their city-states and expanding their territories. Kings would act as lawgivers. These same city-state kings would enact laws and decrees which they often believed to be inspired by their patron gods. And these laws and decrees were enacted to maintain order and justice within their respective city-states. And lastly, kings were builders and they were patrons. Kings commissioned the construction of temples and palaces and other public works, and often dedicating these structures to their patron gods. I would imagine they had large purses because all of the money would come to them in one way or another. But then the other side of the equation in these city-states, the counterpart, if you will, or the corresponding entity in the city-states carrying a lot of power were the city-state priest. They were pagan priests, and these city-state pagan priests served as intermediaries between the gods of that region and the people that worshiped them. Pagan priests in Avram's day performed rituals and sacrifices to appease their deities. These pagan priests served their city-states as spiritual leaders that provided the citizens spiritual guidance, as well as they conducted worship ceremonies, they led religious celebratory festivals, and they conducted daily worship of their pagan patron gods. Pagan priests often served their city-states as economic managers, believe it or not. Since their pagan temples were centers of economic activity, the city's priests managed the wealth and the resources of these institutions, including land and livestock and trade goods. Pagan priests served as advisors to their kings. These often advised their kings on any and all religious matters and were often involved in the governance of their state. Lastly, pagan priests often functioned as healers and educators who provided medical care and education to their community. So, hopefully, as you can see, the intertwining of the religious and the political within each city-state meant that both kings and priests held significant power and influence over their respective communities. And this dual role helped maintain the social order and ensured that the perceived will of their patron gods was respected and followed. Now, before we close this installment, I want to discuss a nuance of leadership that we see embodied in our Melchizedek. That being the offices of king and priest, which we just talked about in relation to the city-states of the ancient Near East, being held by a single individual in their respective region. You see, in most city-states of the ancient Near East, the office of the king was separate from that of the priest. Each office was generally held by a single individual. However, there were rare exceptions, such as we find with the Melchizedek, where the city-state's supreme leader held the dual office of king-priest. One of the rare examples of this is seen with the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Now, these rulers were considered both kings and priests of Egypt. They were often seen and treated as divine or semi-divine leaders who performed religious rituals and maintained Egypt's vast temple holdings. Then we have the Zoroastrian priest, or otherwise famously known as the Magi. And the Magi, if you remember, figured prominently in the birth of Master Yeshua, or the events surrounding his birth, or his early years. They came to pay homage to the new king, the divine king, if you will. In ancient Persia, the Magi were priests who also held significant political power. They were advisors to the kings, and they played a crucial role in Persia's various religious ceremonies. And as an aside, it is believed by many that Daniel, the prophet, oversaw the Magi of his time. And it is through Daniel's provision, because he was a wealthy man in Babylon in those days, in Persia then in that day, because Israel was in bondage, but he oversaw the Magi in Persia. And because of his considerable wealth that was kept by the Magi over the centuries leading up to our Master's birth, they hung on to this promise of a new king who would be born, and they were financed to make the trip from Persia to Judea to visit and see this new king who was born. It's an interesting concept. I do believe that it probably is accurate, but I've not really done a tremendous amount of study on it, but it is extremely interesting to me, the impact of the Zoroastrian priesthood and how they factored into the political power that existed in Persia. Then we have the example of Hindu kings. You see, in ancient India, kings often performed priestly duties and were considered representatives of their Hindu gods on earth. So they conducted religious rituals and maintained India's innumerable temples. They were considered somewhat of royalty, priest of royal standing. And then we have Mayan kings. Archaeologists tell us that in the Mayan civilization, kings were considered divine and they performed various pagan religious ceremonies. And these were seen as intermediaries between their Mayan gods and the Mayan population. So these figures, like Melchizedek, combined political and religious authority in their respective city-states, fulfilling key leadership roles in and throughout their respective societies. So there you have it, beloved. These historic and cultural events, along with a description of the various political and religious roles that governed ancient Near East city-states, provide what I believe to be an essential backdrop to the Melchizedek-Abraham encounter of Genesis 14. And with that, we'll bring this first installment to our Melchizedek series to a close. I pray you were blessed by this fellowship and discussion as I was blessed in putting this together for you. And so, as always, may you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. I bid you Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Until next time, beloved, take care.